We're on. Okay, everybody. Thank you. We're gonna start in just a couple seconds, and I want to praise everybody for coming today, because when I saw the weather, when I looked at my app the other day and I saw what was going to be happening, I went sort of semi-berserk. And as I was telling Dana, I said, we planned this thing. It took close to a year to sort of work out the dates and everything, and then the one date it lands on is bad weather. But that's life, and you all made it out, and Dana in particular, making out from Washington on crutches, which is a sign of the kind of dedication that Donald Trump does not quite respect in journalists. So, and we will talk about that. This is a sacrifice almost as great as the president going out into the rain finally in Paris on his last stab at it. Anyway, so for those of you, I know most of your faces by now, but for those of you who have not been here before, my name is Dick Pullman, and I teach journalism here in the writing program and write columns on the side. And this is the last of the speaker events I've had this semester, and as many of you know, I try to do at least 3 every semester. I have 2 lined up for next spring semester. I can just mention very briefly before we start. One of my former students who wrote a book about the Trump family. She writes for Vanity Fair. Her name is Emily Jane Fox. And she wrote a book about the Trump family called Born Trump, Inside America's First Family. It came out a few months ago. So she's going to be here in the spring. And the other person I have lined up so far is a Metro columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer who was supposed to be here this fall. And she had to cancel at the last minute because she was stuck in the airport in Denver. Her name is Helen Ubinis. Writes for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and is what I like about her is that she portrays and puts a spotlight on a lot of people in inner city Philadelphia neighborhoods who often do not get written about and do not get paid enough attention in the press. So we'll be talking about that stuff as well. And then there'll be a third, as they say in baseball, there's a player to be named later. So I'll fill that in as we go. But today, to talk about our current politics and the writing of politics. Dana has been a columnist at the Washington Post since 2005. Correct me if that's wrong. Before that, he was covering the Bush White House as a White House correspondent, and he's had previous gigs before that as a senior editor for the New Republic and as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And we were just touching base on it. We were actually in London as correspondents at the same time in the 90s, back when we were younger.
Even younger.
Even younger, I should say. So please welcome Dana Milbank here. Some of you may know him also from television, where he does those MSNBC gigs and others as well. So we're going to talk, some of you know the format, it's pretty informal. We're going to just converse up here for maybe 25 minutes tops, and then we'll turn it over to you all in the audience for questions, and I think there'll be a microphone as well. But I just wanted to ask, first of all, this is one of the things that comes up a lot, or at least in my mind, is I think right now in terms of writing, particularly columnizing about the Trump era, it seems in some ways, I think of this Charles Dickens line from the opening of Tale of Two Cities, that it's the best and the worst of times. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think, it's the best of times because there's just so much to write about, and it's such a historic period if you're just looking at it dispassionately that way. But arguably the worst of times in terms of the content of what we have to commentate on. And I was just wondering how you see that, where you fall on which side of that, and why.
All right. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to see you all. And Dick, it's not as much of a sacrifice as you might think. In Trump's Washington, many journalists are very eager for a chance to create some distance from the man in the White House. So this is a real opportunity for me to get away. I can't tell you how many times people come up to me and say, "You must be having so much fun." And the truth is, I'm absolutely not having fun at all. It's a horrible thing. Because what's happening is really no laughing matter, and it's I mean the good part is when you were covering the Bush administration or the Obama administration, it was, except for the occasional war, fairly boring. I mean, because it was routine. You would see what's on the president's schedule. You'd know what we'd be talking about that day. You'd see there'd be a hearing on Capitol Hill. You sort of know how the week would go. And now you don't know how anything's going to, like hour to hour, and everybody's bouncing around with the latest craziness that comes from the Twitters or the world's reaction to it. So, in a way, what's happening on Capitol Hill doesn't matter. The sort of the set piece events of Washington that were sort of my stock and trade. They exist. It's just nobody cares what the appropriations subcommittee is coming up with, because it's all going to get wiped out in the end anyway. The good part is, I never get up in the morning and say, oh my goodness, whatever will I find to write about today? So, it's triage. So it's, you can say, all right, I'll get to the caravan tomorrow because I got to deal with the Florida craziness today. And it's that I was supposed to do the Florida craziness Monday, but I had to deal with the France craziness. So it's just, and how many can you get to? I'm writing 4 columns a week, and the usual load is 2, and I could do fewer, but I feel like there's too much. I wouldn't know how to choose. So it's easier in that sense, but so often you start off with one thing in the morning, and then my deadline's 4 or 5 o'clock, and it is completely feels like this is like last year's news, because there's been there's a news cycle every half hour or every hour. Now you can resist that and just do your own thing, which I like to do, and I think that it's healthy, and not to be moved by whatever the flavor of the moment is, not to be dictated what the agenda is by Trump. The only problem with that is nobody reads it. And you see it over and over again. So we do, and we have this sort of dull but important category, and you know it beforehand. As I say, but you know what? We just got to do this one. And I just think some of my colleagues do the, sort of everyday, the hysterical. It's a Trump catastrophe. Trump is melting down. Trump is this. Trump is that. And it's very good for traffic. It's very good for TV ratings. And it can be good journalism. It's not always, but there's a lot of pressure to do that, and he's really been very successful at keeping the focus all on him, and you stray to your peril. So it's a difficult environment, plentiful but difficult, and also this notion of satire that I do. The idea of satire is you make something ridiculous. So, how do you get more ridiculous than this? I was just saying to somebody before, the defense secretary of the United States of America goes to the border and justifies sending troops there by saying they did it when Pancho Villa was attacking. Like, come on, if I wrote that, everybody would say, you made that up. So now I have to be more ridiculous than Pancho Villa. So I don't know, what do we do now?
Mm-hmm. So, all right. Well, I was going to ask you about the question. I know you try to sort of find the absurdist elements in these things, but they do tend to write themselves. And so how do you outflank that? So you've sort of addressed that. Let me get back to something you just said a second ago about covering Trump and the pressure of, or the temptation to just do Trump all the time. Mm-hmm. That does drive traffic, and I'm just wondering, do you get, either hints or beyond hints from the Post about trying to sort of keep one's traffic up? Because there are all kinds of metrics for it, right?
Right.
You know how many hits you get on pieces, don't you?
Oh, yeah. You can get a rough idea looking at what's the most read, but yeah, we have very, how many people at any given second are reading the piece. And other things, how long they stay with it. But no, thankfully, obviously we care about readers, and that's our business, but there's not a lot of that pressure. And my boss is often saying, no, he wants to encourage people to write about important things, foreign affairs, social policy, things that are not, they're not going to get a lot of traffic. And every once in a while, it'll surprise you and say, okay, that's good. If you do something of quality, it can still break through all of the noise. But, it really, so I don't think it's pressure from the newspaper. I think it's pressure from within. You want to be acknowledged by the readers. You want to be acknowledged by your peers, probably. A lot of it's that. And if you don't have Trump in the headline, you're not reaching the largest. Like this week, after dealing with Trump's hair, which was, of course, people wanted to read about that. So I was writing about Whitaker, the top law enforcement in the United States of America. Now, I think people do care about that. But it wasn't specifically on Trump. But like, I'd got this great stuff about that company he was on the board of. They believed in Bigfoot, and they were promoting time travel, and they actually invented something that we won't discuss here called the masculine toilet. And they announced it in the very same press release that announced Whitaker was on the board. And then like I found like his Senate Judiciary questionnaire when you say the top cases you trial, and it's like, well, I represented Mr. Smith when somebody ran over his leg. This is the Attorney General of the United States. So I think that is, irresistible, and I think it's terrific. But it doesn't get the same kind of readership as saying, Trump is horrible, I pulled all my hair out.
Right.
That's more readers.
Right.
So you make choices.
Well, one of the things I was told years ago when I was much younger, starting a column, was I was told, don't be predictable. And what they meant at the time was, don't sort of bang on the same subject areas all the time. And it seems to me that the temptation because there's so much going on with Trump, and because he does have these ways of driving the news cycle with whatever wacky thing he's saying, which you have to take seriously in a lot of ways, is that the temptation could be to just write about Trump more than, I don't know, 80, 90% of the time. And up until recently, I was writing 5 columns a week. And sometimes I would notice that 5 out of 5 would be Trump related. And I wanted to say, well, you know what? I'm going to go look at what the Democrats are doing.
And then you found out they weren't doing anything.
And they weren't doing anything. So I guess what I'm wondering now is, in terms of maybe being more unpredictable, to the fact that the Democrats have the House and now have a chance to sort of put out some kind of counter narrative and to share the news cycle to some extent. Is this a welcome development? Do you see that as a potentially welcome development, that you can, have more opportunities to vary a mix and get off of Trump-centric stuff?
Yeah, hopefully. And I see, I have a variation on the don't be predictable, and mine is don't make predictions, because you have no idea what's going to happen even minute to minute. And I learned this because I, early on said there is no way the Republican Party will nominate Donald Trump, and if they do, I'm going to eat my column. And so we had a video of it, and I had a chef come in from a steakhouse, and they made every dish was with newspaper, and we had a newspaper taco bowl for Trump, and well done Wagyu with newspaper and newspaper filtered coffee, and so some were okay because you grind it up, and then some had I lifted up my fork once, and there was a Rolex ad hanging from it, and I had to eat that. So I don't make any predictions anymore at all, and I share this hope that there will be some more relevance to something other than Donald Trump. But what you've seen in the last 9 days is that he's not going to let that happen. He's going to be more outrageous. So he continues to dominate. So if anything, the last 9 days have been crazier than the previous couple of years. So I think we're going to see more of that go on. But there's another bit about the being predictable, and really be in the pre-Trump era. I like the idea of not being terribly ideological. I mean, I didn't hide what my ideology was, but I figured it's sort of centrist, and I like to take pops at everybody, and I thought that builds up credibility. What's happened now, at least from my point of view, well, a couple of things. One is there's sort of the market has changed in a way that, there's really, you're not reaching anybody outside of your ideological bubble anymore. And so, I mean, I can write something critical of the Democrats. Nobody's going to really want to read it because the right-wingers are not going to give me credit for doing it. They probably haven't seen it. And then the left is going to say, I don't care about that. So it does sort of push everybody into, being tribal and taking sides. But the other part of Trump is it is very lopsided. You can't say on the one hand and on the other hand. I mean, the President of the United States tweets that, this morning that Robert Mueller worked 8 years for the Obama administration. I mean, what can you can't say, well, on the one hand, that's not true, and on the other hand, no, it's still not true. There's no other hand. So it's it's almost like if you were to try to be balanced now, you'd be contorting yourself to try to find some shred of equivalence, and it's really not, because there's one part of our society that's just gone off the rails. So it makes us all a little predictable.
Well, I was going to ask you if you feel that, I mean, you might have answered this in part, so let me just come at it in a slightly different way. I was going to ask you whether you feel, I don't know if you write, do you feel like you're writing a column for a hypothetical kind of reader or not? I mean, are you writing then, therefore, for people who tend to be agreeing with you at the outset because that's how the market is shaken out, or do you write sort of for some kind of hypothetical person who might be on the fence and might be persuadable?
Well, I'd hope it would be the latter. And I don't know about you, but when I started out in this business, I had this fantasy that my role was sort of to explain Washington to people who didn't care about politics, to sort of feel like I was a foreign correspondent in Washington reporting to the rest of the country about the strange things that happen here. What you realize now that you can see where the traffic comes from, and from the feedback you get, is I think it was always a fantasy. I was always writing for people who cared about politics, because otherwise they weren't reading my column. Even a super well-read column is what, 1.5 million page views. Okay, that's not a large swath of America or the world. So I think I had to abandon, I think everybody does at some point, realizing, no, you're not reaching this, mass audience, unless you're the anchor on the network evening news, which doesn't reach what it did, but still reaches an awful lot of people. So I can't really pretend that I'm writing for people who are detached from the whole system. I still hope that there could be some influence over people who disagree with me. So my column's syndicated by the writers group, and over 300 papers take the column. That's a little misleading. It means they pay for it. It doesn't mean they actually run it. Which is, well, they pay for it. That's good. They'll use it once in a while. Some use it all the time, but they're often in parts of red America. So it is reaching people, and it's on their websites too. So it's reaching people there. Now, but you still have the same issue, and it's probably reaching. And if they don't agree with it, they're not gonna. It's going to be filtered out by Facebook and other ways of receiving blogs, other ways of receiving social media. So you have to be realistic and say, no, you're probably talking to the within an echo chamber. Okay,
but all right. So having it appear in parts of Red America, how do you deal with something I always tell journalism students is that one of the things you need in journalism beyond ability and drive, et cetera, is a thick skin, which is something you kind of develop over time. And I'm wondering, how do you deal with either hostile emails or being Twitter bombed by trolls? And I mean, it's kind of like part of part of the game right now.
Yeah.
Do you have any kind of like an instinctive policy about that? You just kind of, do you ignore it? Do you engage some of it?
Yeah, my instinctive policy is to hide. I used to actually do this by, this was more in a decade ago. I would they insisted on having our emails on the column, but then you just get this, like in the old days, people wrote you a letter, and I had this policy. I would write everybody back. I was like, okay, that's not going to work. Because it was the same 10 people with the same with the same rant over and over, but with an actual postage stamp sent with an actual mail. But so when they started putting the email on the column, I was like, can we just put a dummy email on? But no, it needed an actual email. But I was able to program, I guess it was Lotus Notes in those days, so I could tell where it was coming from, and if somebody clicked on the byline, it would be coded in such a way. So it went to a file I called loons. Just so I didn't have. And every once in a while, I'd check the loon file, see what the lobster trap brought in. But now with social media, that's not really viable either. I do hide a lot from social media. I don't tweet nearly as much as most do. Just do the bare minimum. I do not read the comment section. I mean, I'm delighted to know it's getting a lot of comments. That's a good thing. It means people are reading it. And usually the first 20 are about the column, and then they're calling each other names. But I do, so I engage on Twitter sporadically, and if I feel like there's a real push or something, then I'll push back against it. And I still try to answer most emails, not all. But so I get a sense of the criticism from there as well, or the ratio of criticism. As with all things in the Trump era, it's taken on a much more ugly tone. And so I'm Jewish and write about these matters of anti-Semitism, and it's really, there's occasional death threats. I mean, usually it's more like they're not actually saying they will kill me. They're saying they wouldn't mind if I were dead. Which I think is not, they're not offering.
That's a comforting
They're not
distinction.
offering to take an action. So like you say, you should be strung up from a lamppost. But I'm not saying I'm not threatening you. I'm like, oh, well, that's good.
Yeah, I mean,
You're not dangerous to me then.
Because I was wondering if you got some of that after that. You did a piece after the Pittsburgh.
That was the lamppost one, and I was like, oh, well, that's good. He's at least being very clear with me that it's not his intention to do it, but he might be applauding it if it were to occur.
Well, one press issue that is very much in the news this week that I want to get your take on was the what happened at the White House with CNN. I'm sure you guys all know about this, with Jim Acosta getting his CNN guy getting his hard pass, as they call it, pulled by the White House after a disagreeable session there in front of Trump's at his news conference right after the midterms. CNN sued just the other day on Tuesday. They filed a lawsuit. It was argued in court, I guess, yesterday or today.
Yesterday, I think there's more today.
Yeah, and there might be some kind of decision this afternoon. Most major news organizations, including Fox News, have filed amicus briefs on behalf of CNN's position that this is an infringement of the First Amendment. And I was wondering, you covered the White House, so you were at press briefings and during the much more staid Bush era. I'm wondering to what extent you find this either a disturbing development or maybe perhaps in terms of how this might turn out a promising development in terms of, if there's some kind of ruling that says, hey, he can't arbitrarily decide, who's going to ask questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's very disturbing so far because you literally have the lawyers for the president saying there is no First Amendment right for anybody, any journalist to be at the White House.
That's what they said. The
president is free to kick out anybody for any reason. Something he specifically said he wouldn't do, by the way, when he was kicking, the Washington Post and others not allowing them to cover events on the campaign trail. So we, obviously went in anyway. But I think many are conflicted by the Acosta thing. I don't really like his methods. You need to ask questions. Sometimes you need to shout the question if you're not getting the answer. You don't need to sit there and argue with the president. It's not even a matter of disrespectful. It's a matter of ask your question, get your answer, ask a follow-up. But 4 or 5 times arguing back and forth, let somebody else ask a question. So I don't, and that's not just Jim. I think, it's a little bit of a TV disease. And, back in the previous White Houses, you'd always feel like everybody's in the front row is showing off for the cameras, and we're not actually making any progress here. So, that on one side, but the much more important thing is you don't kick somebody out of the White House for asking questions. And, particularly, they actually use a doctored video of claiming he assaulted this intern. They didn't actually claim that in court because it would be rather more consequential to lie to a judge than to lie to the public. So I think we're all sort of reluctantly, of course, everybody's on CNN and Acosta's side in this. I'd sort of wish, journalists would be more restrained in how they ask the question. The truth is, you get more out of Trump when you just ask an innocent question. Like many of the most outrageous things he has said that have gotten him in the most trouble come from Fox News interviews because they just tee it up and
relax.
La 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 la, and he talks. So he might not be as angry, but he's definitely going to say something crazy. So my view is just ask the question. You give him enough rope to hang himself, and don't argue because he'll get angry and say something outrageous, but you'll actually get more, I think, the other way. So yes, we're all now we're all Jim Acosta, so they have to prevail.
Do you think overall that sometimes there's been arguments in the last couple of years that the White House press briefings, particularly under Sarah Huckabee Sanders, have become basically worthless, that reporters are used as props for them just sort of spewing this propaganda, fact-challenged propaganda. Are the White House briefings still worth, if you were covering the White House, would you find them valuable just to sort of as an argument for, well, we got to see what their thinking is to the extent that it's thinking? Because some people are saying that they're not even worth going to anymore.
Well, I dispute the premise of your question, Dick, because it implies that they were worth something before. And it's been a long time, and I think that, the TVs came in to the regular briefing, I think, in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. And I think ever since then, it's just been a show for the TV journalists, so they can be on their broadcasts. They have cameras, trained on the press secretary, whoever's up there, and almost as many cameras trained back on the TV journalist asking the question. So I think the briefing used to be a way to give out information, and now it's just showbiz on both ends. So it's not. It doesn't serve any purpose now. They don't really happen that much. It's been like once a month or so. So the president talks far more in public than the press secretary. And far more freely. So you never want to say no, we shouldn't attend them, or because it could, you don't ever want to give up something because there may be a time when it's useful again, and it could be this exchange. I think it'd be terrific to take away the cameras, so nobody's showing off and nobody feels they have to send a message to their base, and they can just impart information. So everybody reflexively says, yes, you have to have the briefings, but I wouldn't spend a lot of time there.
Because he can make news as it is just by what he tweets. And so then there's the other argument that goes back and forth as to how much should we be paying attention to everything he tweets. And so there's one argument saying, well, he's still the president, and so anything he says has to be, even if you're going to parse it or dispute it, it has to be, attention must be paid. And then some people are saying, no, the press is just like hanging on every single tweet, and then that ends up sort of like, fouling the discourse. So, I don't know. When you wake up in the morning and you check his feed, which you probably do.
Well, yeah, I had it for a while. I had it, it would be forwarded like a text, and it would start buzzing, but then I was waking up at 4 a.m. and because you never know when he's going to. So I had to put on the silent overnight function, so I could rest. But it's really jolting. It's like any time of day or night. You can be out in the garden, whatever, and there's some apocalyptic tweet coming through. so that's it's unavoidable to some extent. I think we're getting better at it now. So rather than just saying, Trump just said this, can you believe it? It's more like Trump, without evidence, just declared there was fraud. So, you know, and TV's sort of doing it in real time now. They're giving in the full context. And you know, we're 20 minutes after the tweet, we'll have a piece up and say, you know, that will soberly say, you know, what he said and what's reality. So I think that's fair and responsible. Right? You know, don't want to completely ignore it. Certainly don't want to hype it or just put it out there without context. But you know, it's like belatedly we're figuring this out, and it's the same thing with the coverage of the rallies. It was always everybody had them, you know, nonstop, and even Fox has stopped. I think they're really, you know, people are bored. It's the same thing over and over with, you know, 30 seconds of unique craziness. But, you know, they can get that in the broadcast after. So I think we've finally figured it out, but it's taken a rather long time.
So did you come up with, did you decide to do 4 columns a week? Now, was this your decision, or did they want you to do 4 because of all the news?
No, I had started doing that well before, and I was at the point where I was like, you know, I think I'm going to cut back, and you know, I'll try to get a professorship.
I recommend it. The camera's on.
You know, or to, you know, do long magazine pieces, write a book, that sort of thing. But there's just no way to stop at this point. I can't stop. It's like it's like nicotine or something.
Well, I'm just going to ask a couple more questions before we open up, and these are more sort of on the writing end of things. You mentioned before that your deadline's 4 p.m.
Yes, 4 or 5 p.m.
4 to 5 p.m. And I know every piece is different, so there's probably no way to answer this question. But generally speaking, how long and how many words? You have a word count, basically? Are you talking like 800, 1,000?
It's officially 750, and as long as I'm under 800, they don't scream. So that's what I do.
Okay. And how long? Again, I know they're all different, but generally speaking, how long does it take you to put together an 800-word piece that satisfies you enough to let others see it?
Well, sometimes a full day isn't enough, but it still goes out. You know, it depends. And one weird thing about the internet age is if you're writing for the web, you can file anytime you want. And but because the column still appears in the newspaper, and because you know newspaper subscriptions are down so much, we're down to 1 printing plant. I think there were 3 before. And the deadline, I mean, my 4 or 5 o'clock deadline was 7 or 8 o'clock when I started doing this. So it's really condensed the time you have to write this. But it's still important. The printed paper still has a lot of sway. So it's worth doing that, but it's definitely very condensed. And inevitably, there's going to be some huge news at 4 or 5 o'clock that is, you know, makes you need to either rip it up or be irrelevant. You know, for special events, we can extend them. I think some of the columns I like the most are done in 2 hours. You know, because actually when they take you a long time, it means you're probably not exactly focused on what you want to say. It's like one of my favorite columns I ever wrote was when it was during the campaign, and Trump said something about, he was using Yiddish, like she got schlonged or something, right? So I just picturing what my grandmother would say to him. I knew some Yiddish words, and I went to my Yiddish dictionary, so I just did a whole column of calling him names in Yiddish, and it took like an hour. And it was like, it got a gazillion views, and everybody loved it and talked about it forever. So you know, it's great when that happens, or sometimes, you know, it's off an event and you have to do it in 2 hours, and that focuses the mind, and I think they're often better than the ones when I have a full day to do them. I think you know, the writing is always a short period of time. Too short. I mean, there's no time to, you know, rewrite and rewrite as you would if you cared about your work, but if you had that luxury. but a lot of the time is in the research component rather than the writing. So that's the variable. And if you don't have time to research, well, you just wing it.
Right. Well, all right. So I'll give you one example, and then we're going to take questions. I mean, this piece the other day that you did on the on Trump's adventures in Paris when he didn't come to some of these events because of the rain. You can tell me how long it took you to do that, but there's obviously was a lot of research that went into this piece because there's a million links in the piece. But I thought what was interesting was what you did with the opening. I'll just quote it for you guys. First, he set up a contrast. Dana set up a contrast. First quoting a poem by a Canadian soldier, and this passage was, "We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields." And he quotes that. And then it's contrasted with President Trump noting his own sacrifice during a centennial observance. Then the quote is, "We're getting drenched," because he was complaining about the rain. So you were obviously, there you've got this, you've set up this, this contrast. It was like more show than tell. You were setting it up just in the contrast. And I was just curious, and this is just kind of like, a writer think here. Did you come up with that as sort of an initial way to start it? Or was that something that you just thought, you maybe wrote other parts of it and then decided, oh, here's a way I can start it afterwards? How did you come by that opening?
I was looking for, like, we all have that in Flanders Field, the poppies. And it was in there, and then I was mixing it in my head with a poem I quoted at the very end of the piece.
Right.
So I'd had them too garbled together, but then I looked it up. And then as soon as I saw "We are the dead" and Trump was saying "We're getting drenched," I was like, oh, that's beautiful. I did a little happy dance because it fits so well together. But yeah, so that's one that took a long time because I had to find out what he did here, what he did there. So that was annoyingly long. The writing of it was, again, 2 hours. But there was a lot of research, and those dreaded links were involved. But those are sometimes Trump sacrificed his hair. We sometimes sacrifice by working.
All right, so I'm going to just let you guys, this is the easier part for me, let you guys ask questions. I don't know if we have a microphone. We do have the microphone. Thank you so much. Let's start in the front, and we'll get you guys. Right there.
Are either one of you aware that there's a Nazi rally scheduled for Saturday at Independence Square? And as a Jewish community, we've been told not to go there, to stay away, which I think is a good idea. Do you have any comments about it? And what can the media do fighting this anti-Semitism that seems to be growing?
I think the best thing is to ignore it, and that they did their thing at Lafayette Square a year after Charlottesville. I think 20 of them showed up or something. It was, there were counter demonstrators that just dwarf them. So I mean, you can do that. I just yes, there are a very small number who actually go out and do this stuff. The problem is you can't, they can communicate through social media and the dark web, and they're gonna be able to amass now because they can do it that way. And there's nothing. There's nothing to be done, and hopefully there's no violence, and the president's not calling them fine people, and then we're fine.
I had this written before at the beginning of the talk. I am surprised, actually annoyed, that commentators or journalists do not bring attention to the fact that the Nazis in America are descended from immigrants. They don't talk about that. They didn't come over on the Mayflower.
Well, they're immigrants too. Yeah, I mean, it's yes. I mean, it's often pointed out that we're a nation of immigrants. It's an irony that has been noted many times. I don't. And we've pointed out that the president is family has emigrated not so long ago. I don't know. I don't think this is a question of media or commentating. I think that's it's just one of those ironies. It's not like people aren't aware of that, but it bears repeating.
Right. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I have to tell you, I've been to many programs here. I can't imagine 10 years ago that Dick Pohlman would be interviewing somebody and you'd be talking about a death threat against a journalist. It just seems astounding to me the way our country's changed in so many ways. And so 2 parts of my question. One is, how can we get rid of that? How can we go back to normal where journalists aren't threatened and people aren't killed in a synagogue in Pittsburgh? And the second part is, what responsibility does Trump have for inciting or enabling or setting the tone for the man in Pittsburgh and also for the person who writes to you? How do we deal with that?
Well, it's a good question. The question was put to Trump, and you should know that he does not bear any responsibility. So that's settled. But it is not. I mean, this. It's not like Trump became the president and all this stuff happened, or he started his campaign and all this stuff happened. He saw where the culture was going, and it's been going that way for 2-3 decades, our politics particularly. So he just saw a way to exploit that, and of course it's made it a lot worse. But this stuff is not going to go away after Trump. He's pointed out that this exists, this clash between the growing multicultural America and the fading non-college educated white America. I mean, it's a very serious clash of cultures, and it's going to be resolved in decades from now. But it's going to be an ugly time as people come to terms with what that means. So I don't think I blame Trump for making it as awful as it is, and the fact that people have the weapons they do makes it that much more dangerous. There were threats against. I mean, journalists have been killed in this country, long before Trump. And the threats I receive are nothing compared to people who are big TV personalities, the recognizable ones. That's much more dangerous. And even we have all kinds of security at our place now. So I don't think that'll change for some time. Now I think maybe where you're going there is also what's our responsibility, because it's sort of like in this new normal, it's like anything goes. I mean, we print vulgar words in the newspaper now because the president said them, but it's almost like it's loosened all of our standards. And I'm sure that if I were giving it a cold, sober analysis, I would say that in my columns I'm probably being too harsh with some people, or not giving their credit for good motives, and things that I might have paused at before, probably not doing it now. So we all have a responsibility. And I suppose we can satisfy ourselves by saying whatever we're doing, it's not as bad as what he's doing, but that's not necessarily a good excuse. But I think we're reflecting the culture, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be more introspective.
Yes. Let's go to somebody way in the back, and then we'll work our way back, because the back often gets overlooked. There you go.
Hi, thank you for the talk. That was very interesting. I'd like to know what Jeff Bezos is like as a newspaper owner. He probably doesn't interfere with on the editorial side, but to what extent do you feel his influence and presence, and why did he decide to save Washington Post and not New York Times or some of the other papers?
Because it's the failing New York Times. There's nothing.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
It was hopeless. Yeah, failing. Well, I love Jeff Bezos. I think you should all have Amazon Prime accounts and shop at Whole Foods and buy his rockets and time clocks and whatever else he does. You're right. He doesn't interfere with the our journalism, similar to the Graham family before that. I think he probably did see it as a public service. It's not like he really needs to make a few more dollars. Although they say the Washington Post makes money. I mean, it's not a public company, but it probably is not losing him. He's probably not, very anxious about our balance sheet. But he's in communication with my boss on the editorial side, and Marty Barron on the news side, and he has people involved in the business. What's been terrific about it is we have had a huge expansion. Hiring the best people from around journalism. We're not quite at the peak where we were, I guess, in the 80s, 90s, but it's just about there. And then so the way it's marketed to tablets, other newspapers around the country, the readership is, a whole order of magnitude beyond anything we had in the old days. So we were really at a point where they literally had stopped repairing the plumbing in the old building. There were rodents. It was like the end of the world. And now it's a totally different era. Yeah, it seems like it. I'm surprised you're not working there already. It seems. I walk through the newsroom. I'm like, who are these people? I don't know.
Until that happens, buy a fire stick. Where's the mic? Okay, right over there, and then we'll come back down to you, sir.
I first wanted to thank you for coming to our campus this afternoon and speaking. A few years ago, I read Neil Postman's nonfiction book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And recently, I reread the book again because to me, it seems relevant now more than ever before, because in the book, he explains how television and news media has altered public discourse into just mere entertainment. Looking into the future, how do you think we as Americans can help ourselves get out of the hole that we dug for ourselves right now, where we are entertaining ourselves to death with our politics?
Well, my answer in these circumstances is to punt, but to send it back to you, though. I do think that, as we were saying earlier, we got to this point over a long period of time. It was basically a breakdown. I mean, part of it was a historical change in our politics. It became aligned with race, and we didn't really have a fully functioning democracy until the 60s or the 70s. So some of that was unavoidable. Some of it was generational, I think. Basically the boomers with Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich are on the cusp of the boom. Basically 92, 94. 94 is the point where the boomers took over politics from the greatest generation. And I think the significance there was they fought a war together, and they recognized that the guy on the other side of the aisle isn't the enemy. They were able to function together. And I think something about, the 60s and the polarization of the boomers has turned politics into warfare. And so I used to think my generation would make it better, and then we got Ted Cruz. So I no longer have hope that we're going to be any better at this. And Tom Cotton, we've got some winners, but I do think the next generation and the one after that, all signs suggest that, and part of it's the changing demography of the country, but there's a huge change coming. You saw it in a small way last week, much higher. Millennial voting and completely lopsided in how they vote. So you can see a whole new consensus coming through the pipeline. So basically you just need all of us older folks to die. How's that?
We have one over here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Thank you. I must admit, I'm still holding a grudge against the entire Washington press corps for coverage of Hillary's emails. And feel free to issue a mea culpa should you feel so inclined. But I'm wondering, how does the American public protect themselves against something similar happening in 2020 when journalists are certainly after the best ratings and conflict and drama achieve those?
Yeah. I mean, one result of last week, the midterms, is they're going to actually have to stop looking into Hillary's emails now in the House for the first time. But maybe the Justice Department will pick up the torch and they can keep going. The emails, I believe it was a legitimate story. I don't, I mean, it went on and on and on after, everything there was to know. I think something I'm more troubled by is the way journalists sort of took the stolen DNC emails, stolen material from WikiLeaks, which now is finally coming back to bite the people involved. But we're always going to sort of look for that shiny object. There's just no way around it. It's going to happen again and again. Hopefully, people can be more responsible. But I think if you looked at my newspaper, it was responsible. It's the effect of cable news. So it doesn't matter what the Washington Post does. Trump's people are watching Fox, so there's no way to control that. And then, through social media, it doesn't really matter what we're doing because people are going to get the news they want to get. So I don't think, I'm not trying to excuse the media. I'm just saying I don't think there's a whole lot we can do other than just keep doing our job and, publishing everything, and people will make up their own minds for better or for worse. But even if that were that same, despite all that happened during that campaign, Hillary Clinton won it by a few million votes. So it would, because of this demography I keep coming back to, do you know if the same election, if everybody turned out in the same with the same margin of vote and the same numbers, and it were rerun just because of demographic changes in 2020, Hillary would have won both the popular vote and the Electoral College, and it just keeps getting more exaggerated from there. So there's only so much these pyrotechnics can do in the end, and you saw that last Tuesday. I mean, what didn't they throw at it? In terms of the caravan, and they're coming to murder every man, woman, and child. So it didn't work.
But I guess it's just the comparison of coverage, say, of Trump's using the iPhone for a security leak. Mm-hmm. That was a one-day story, two-day story. How long did it go for coverage of Hillary's email server, which actually never did get hacked? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. How do we protect ourselves against that?
I think it's a demand side problem, not a supply side problem. I mean, that one story in particular was, I think it was a Times story that I'm not sure anybody else was able to confirm. Now, the Hillary email story came to light because of the Benghazi committee in the House. Don't forget that. So, now there is the equivalent, I suppose, so they can dig up information that will find the equivalent about Trump. I'm not so sure that's what Democrats should be doing. I think they should be, passing health care. But yeah, they'll be doing more of that.
Yeah, I'll just throw in one observation about that. It seems to me that part of the problem was, and maybe some of us didn't recognize it at the time, was that the antipathy toward Hillary that was out there was fertile ground for a lot of people to just say, aha, here's another example of her chicanery. And, and it was kind of there sort of like maybe a little bit more under the radar than we generally kind of expected at the time. And so it was fertile. And that's why, when the conservative media is driving it, and, also through the Facebook and, these under the radar media streams now, that, those of us who believe otherwise, we just got basically, we didn't get outvoted. We only got outvoted in the Electoral College sense, but I don't know if that's replicated next time.
Well, I should have mentioned it. You're right, that there was a unique media antipathy toward Hillary Clinton. I think some of it was unfair and gender related. I think a lot of it was based on 2 decades of really bad relations between the two.
Yeah.
And then Trump I mean, he's horrible for the press, but I mean, one thing about him, he's extremely accessible. Like, he has answered way more questions than Obama or Bush, I'm sure, combined. I mean,
That's true.
Fortunately, not too many of these hour-and-a-half press conferences, because none of us could survive too many of those. But you know, very basically every day he's taking questions. So he is accessible. That really worked for. So he was the media I think was easier on him during the campaign.
We have a question right up here in the front.
Hi. You've worked with all of these very prestigious newspapers for most of your career, I take it. And that media used to be totally dominant for public discourse in this country, in my view at least. But that has changed now, and we have this sort of counter-discourse of Fox News, a sort of counter-journalism, as it were, of Fox News and the other conservative media outlets. And I was just curious that, as a journalist, you must know these other journalists in Washington to some degree. What do you think of them? I mean, professionally, I mean, what are they doing? I mean, how do they understand their role in what they're doing when it seems to be so against the norms of the kind of journalism that's taught in journalism schools and so forth?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I think the partisan media that we have now is not really something altogether new. It's what was unusual is what we had before with the networks and a few dominant newspapers that were sort of attempting this impartiality. And I think that's basically, I mean, I'm an opinion guy, but that's basically what we still do. And you know, the Post has far more reach than it ever had before. It's national and international. But you're right. I mean, things are more fragmented generally. But in terms of the people, I mean, Fox News has some first-rate journalists. Been covering events with them for years. I think a lot of them are in a tough place, and maybe it's fair to ask, why do they want to do that? You know, why not go somewhere else? And I suspect some would if there were opportunities, and some have. When we were back in the day, wasn't Major Garrett was working for Fox, and you know he's doing CBS now. But a lot of them are straight, serious journalists, and there's a lot of tension within Fox News. And you'll often see one show debunking another show because, I mean, basically, if you take away their primetime programming, and the morning and the afternoon, no, take away everything, but Shep Smith, they're great. But I mean, for the most side, it's straight news during the day with as a slant. But you're gonna find out what's happening. It's not propaganda like you'd get in the evening. And in fairness, that. It's not dissimilar at MSNBC. I mean, it's dissimilar in the extremities of it, but in terms of the ideological balance between primetime and dayside. But very often, and my colleague Eric Wempel's been writing about this. Fox journalists are debunking their hosts, and their hosts are trying to ignore the things that the Fox journalists have found out. So it's really basically this propaganda machine that is trying to push honest journalists in a difficult place.
I should also just mention that I just heard that Chris Wallace is going to be interviewing Trump on Sunday morning on Fox News Sunday. So Chris Wallace is probably on the more professional end.
Yeah, I mean,
wouldn't you say?
Occasionally you sort of see an ideology, but I think he's first rate, and I think Brett Baer's terrific, and I'm sure I can come up with others if you give me time.
We'll give you a few minutes. Right here in the second row, and we'll finish off in just a few minutes, folks.
Pleasure to be here inside and warm instead of outside in the
Yes,
snow.
indeed.
My question is, as we consider Trump's lies, his bullying, his denigrating of world leaders and others, what's the other strategy that the Republicans have been employing, that they've taken away a lot of things through gerrymandering, policy changes, the naming of judges, and what is going to be the long-term implication of all of that that has gone on behind the scenes?
Well, I'm not. It's a lot of it's not even behind the scenes. It's right. It's right out there for everybody to see. You know, look, I'm less troubled by all of those things you're talking about than what well, the foreign leaders. Another category, but like if you look at regulations, if you look at judges, like in terms of my ideology, I disagree with what they're doing. But you know, the judges he's appointing, for the most part, are within the mainstream of judicial thought. You may not agree with them. I don't agree with them, but I don't think they're operating outside of the constraints of a constitutional democracy, whereas I think the president frequently is in saying, I'm going to rewrite the birthright provisions of the Constitution with an executive memo, or the First Amendment doesn't apply, or the long-lasting damage in terms of our allies. But so I feel like as long as the system is preserved, it will, over time, adjust to all of the regulatory changes, the judicial changes, as long as we're all sort of playing by the rules. So that's why I'm not as upset about. I mean, I may be upset because I disagree with it, but I'm not. I don't see it as a threat to our democracy. Look at Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. I'm sure I don't agree with them on just about anything. I wouldn't have nominated them or voted for them if I were in the position to do that. But neither can I say that that judicially that they were, not part of the our democratic experiment.
Can you recommend? We're going to finish just a second, Paul. I'm just going to finish with a couple questions that I had hanging on me. Can you recommend any columnists that you think folks here should be reading? Other people who you think are really good that maybe we're overlooking? Besides yourself, of course, in case
And you're all reading Dick Pullman?
Yeah.
5 times a week?
No, Ryan's 2 or 3 now.
Okay. At the Post, it's like I can't pick among my children. I think I love Michael Gerson. He's a conservative. I mean, it's there's liberal, there's conservative, and then there's Trump, and we don't really have many of them. I mean, we have a couple, but it's hard. Yeah. So I think Michael Gerson is a lovely writer. Also on the conservative side, I like Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis, he writes a lot for Daily Beast, doesn't he? Yeah.
And yeah, you see him on TV a bit now. And on the I think the most influential ones at the Post now are. So Jen Rubin is still officially a conservative, but she's really gone through a full conversion. She's been through the mikveh and everything. She's now a full. She's far to the left of me, but she's wow. I mean, I'm in awe of how she's like 6 times a day.
I know. She writes more than anybody I've ever seen.
I'm absolutely in awe of that. I don't know. Every time I go down this path, I'm, I like Leonhard at the Times. I love Frank Bruni. I don't know, a million others.
Okay, well, that's a few right there. And I think what's interesting about Gerson is Gerson was either Bush, he was a senior aide to George W. Bush.
Chief speechwriter, yeah.
And he's not just, as you say, a lovely writer, but he can come at things through that filter. And his assessment of the Trump administration has been quite withering, coming from that perspective. So it's just an easy barometer. A handy and useful barometer. So are you? Do you aspire to do anything else? Or like you said before, you said you can't stop and it's like nicotine. Is that for the far foreseeable future? Do you aspire to do anything else for the rest of your career?
I aspire to do something with your career. I'm always planning to write my next book, and I have been for 10 years, and I'm just waiting for the idea. I've got everything else is lined up. So I'm always thinking I'm going to do that. But yeah, I think you reach a point in your career and say, I'm probably not going to law school. Med school is probably not going to happen either. So, I mean, if you can get one of those plum teaching jobs, then you want to.
That helps.
Then you want to do that. But no, I think I'd write some books, but I don't anticipate any dramatic career changes.
No, well, with 2020 looming ever closer, I wouldn't imagine you would anyway. So.
No, I mean, it used to feel like I would have to because our businesses were collapsing. But so I'm now in this very unexpected area of being in this growing industry, and it's like, wow, maybe I can keep doing this.
All right, well, let's welcome.
Thank you.
Let's send him back to Washington.
Send them, get rid of them.
Get him out of here. And good luck with your foot, by
All
the way.
right, thank you. All right, my friend.